Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Orestes Palermos. He is lecturer in the School of English, Communication and Philosophy at Cardiff University. He works at the intersection of philosophy of mind and cognitive science, epistemology, philosophy of science, and philosophy of technology. He is interested in the idea of philosophical engineering, the way philosophy can impact the design of emerging technologies and socio-technical systems. So, Dr. Palermos, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so let's start with a bit of epistemology. So, in your work, I read about these two different concepts, internalism and externalism. So, could you tell us what are they, what they are about, and particularly in this context of epistemology?
Sure. So, this is a very broad distinction within mainstream analytic epistemology. And mainly it refers to the way some people think about the notion of justification. So knowledge is supposed to be roughly justified through belief. And then the externalism, internalism distinction refers to how we should think about this component of justification. And the received view, at least for many years, was supposed to be the approach of internalism, which basically says that, if you are justified for what you believe, then you should have some kind of explicit reasons in support of your belief that are available to you through reflection alone. And if you think about it, that's kind of, it makes sense, or at least it's not surprising, right? I might ask you, how do you know something? And then you might say stuff like, because I heard someone saying so, or I read it on the news, or I saw it. So you offer reasons in support of your belief. The problem is, though, that this kind of approach, even though it might sound intuitive in the beginning, it has a few problems. One of them is that there are beliefs like our empirical beliefs or our perceptual beliefs that we don't seem to be in a position to offer positive reasons in the support just by reflection due to Hume's problem of induction. So this is one theoretical problem. And then, even if we could get past this problem, internalism seems to be a little bit psychologically implausible because there are also a bunch of beliefs that we entertain through our vision or through our hearing that, we don't really know why they are reliable, right? Because we do not know how our vision works or how our memory works. At least most of us don't. And so it doesn't seem very fair to expect people to be in a position to support those empirical and perceptual beliefs. So externalists deny that in order to be justified, you need to have within your consciousness, let's say, those supportive reasons in favor of your beliefs. Rather, they say that in order to be justified, all you want is that your beliefs happen to be reliable and that somehow you can be responsible in holding those beliefs, but without being in a position to offer necessarily positive reasons in the support. And so, it is mainly a distinction about how much we expect from knowers to offer to us when they claim that they know something.
Right. And do you fall specifically on one side of the aisle versus the other? Are you an internalist or an externalist, for example?
So I think that the truth probably lies somewhere in between, right? So it is true that internalism is too strong and it asks perhaps for too much. So I don't think that in order to be justified, we must always be in a position to offer explicit reasons in support of our beliefs. So I think that externalism gets this right. But at the same time, internalists are probably correct in the underlying intuition that, when you know, you must believe what you believe in a responsible manner, right? Like there must be something from your point of view that allows you to be confident in what you believe. So how might we do this if we don't really have reasons for what we believe? I think it all has to do with the integrated nature of our cognitive systems. So I think that what happens is that, our visual system and our hearing system and our memory system and our capacities for logic and, rational reasoning, they're somehow integrated. And so whenever we get to be presented with a belief, what happens is that, those different systems monitor each other. And whenever there is a mismatch or something going wrong, then we get an alert signal that, better now check your belief again. Otherwise, if we are not presented with alert signals, then we can confidently believe what we believe, even though we don't have reasons, explicit reasons to offer in support of all our beliefs. So it is the absence of alert signals generated by the integrated nature of our belief systems that allows us to be epistemically responsible, not the possession of positive reasons.
Right. So I wanted to ask you more about externalism, particularly because I think that what I'm going to ask you now about will be important for later on when we talk about the philosophy of technology and the relationship between epistemology and certain types of technology. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there are three main theses in externalism: the hypothesis of extended cognition, the extended mind thesis, and the hypothesis of distributed cognition. So could you explain them, please?
Yes, of course. One thing to keep in mind is that, this distinction between internalism and externalism now, it is a distinction within philosophy of mind. So it refers slightly different thing from what epistemologists have in mind.
Okay.
And actually, within philosophy of mind, the distinction is easier to grasp. Basically, cognitive internalists think that the whole of our minds is contained within our heads, or, if they want to be more open-minded about it, they say our whole bodies. Whereas externalists, they are more receptive of the possibility that perhaps our minds are not just situated within our heads, but they might be extended to technologies that we heavily interact with. This is the extended cognition thesis. Or they can be even distributed between several individuals that they collaborate in order to achieve a cognitive goal. And so this is the idea of distributed cognition. An example of extended cognition would be someone using pen and paper in order to solve a complex arithmetical problem, whereas an example of distributed cognition would perhaps be, let's say, a team of scientists collaborating in order to perform some scientific experiments. The idea of distributed cognition comes from the idea of a hive mind and a superorganism. So it is supposed to be, the case of a superorganism, but performed by a team of humans.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that at the beginning of your answer, you mentioned the fact that now we were talking about externalism more in the context of philosophy of mind instead of epistemology. So in what ways do you think philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognitive science intersect with epistemology?
Well, epistemology is, in at least the way I think about it, is the aspect of philosophy that focuses on specifically epistemic cognitive processes and mental states. So, for instance, knowledge is perhaps the most valuable cognitive state that we humans possess. Someone might say, no, it is not knowledge, it is understanding. Epistemology focuses on those cognitive states that are specifically related to our epistemic nature, so either knowledge or understanding or know-how. And so you might say that epistemologists are philosophers of mind that specifically focus on those epistemic states. And so there is a lot within cognitive psychology, as well as philosophy of mind, and more broadly, cognitive science, that epistemologists can use in order to better understand those epistemic states that they are interested in.
Right. So I would like to ask you, before getting into technology, what is social epistemology?
So social epistemology is, let's say, a subfield of epistemology that specifically focuses on how social factors or social institutions and organizations might affect knowledge acquisition and other epistemic states. So, for instance, social factors such as, do people around me tend to tell the truth, or do people around me tend to be gullible? If that is the case, how does this affect my ability to acquire knowledge? Or, for instance, how do the mass media that I rely on operate? What are their properties, and how the properties of those media affect the way that I might acquire knowledge? Or, for instance, do I want to build a successful research team that is capable to, and that relates to your previous question, that is capable of organizing itself like a superorganism that is going to produce knowledge as a team as a whole? Then, how should I go about designing that team of scientists, say, in order to generate knowledge as if it were an integrated individual agent? And social epistemology focuses on these kinds of questions.
Mm-hmm. Does it also answer questions like, for example, if it is better for us to try to understand knowledge as being stored inside individuals or being distributed across individuals from a given society, something like that?
May I ask you what you mean by a given society? How broad do you think about this society?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure. Perhaps a society where people share the same culture, for example.
Right, right. So far at least, mainstream epistemology and social epistemology have focused on specific and more well-defined teams of individuals. So, as I gave you the example previously of a scientific research team, right? Could we see a scientific research team under certain occasions as an integrated epistemic agent in itself, right? But usually scientific research teams, they're not. They're not comprised of very many individuals, although some of them do, right? The Atlas experiment, let's say, in CERN, thousands of people operate there. And perhaps in those cases, you can see that, even a society that is made out of 1,000 individuals or even more could be seen as an epistemic subject in itself. The thing is, though, that, even that is a very well-defined team. It's not like society at large.
Right.
It's not a state. That is probably a claim that is less easier to make, although, maybe in the future a case could be made for it as well.
Yeah, okay, so we talked a little bit about extended cognition earlier. Uh, are there some technologies that allow for extended cognition apart from perhaps the basic pen and paper?
Sure. Pen and paper is a nice example because it's also a little bit low tech, and it's something that most of us use not just when we do arithmetic, but when we write essays or poems. You know, somehow we externalize our thoughts and we play around with them and we move them around and we rearrange them. And you know, in this way, we think about our thoughts. So this is what Andy Clark refers to as second order cognitive dynamics. But of course, there are also more high tech examples. My favorite one, the one that I think is the most impressive, is the case of tactile visual substitution systems, which are used by blind subjects in order to perceive the world. So basically, these systems, they consist of a pair of sunglasses that have attached on them a mini video camera that converts the visual input into tactile stimulation under the agent's tongue. And so what happens is that very soon individuals interacting with these kind of systems, they start perceiving shapes and objects around them, and sometimes they can interact with them very, very efficiently, and other times they even report as if they feel that they see. And so this is supposed to be a case where, you know, neither the tactile visual substitution system on its own can see, nor the blind agent, but put them together, and on the basis of the interaction, you get a subject that is capable of quasi-visually perceiving the world. And so you might say that, you know, perception in this case, which is a paradigmatic cognitive process, extends beyond the agent's brain to the artifact that they interact with. So I think this is, you know, it's difficult to deny this as a good example of cognitive extension. Other potential examples might involve many of the applications on our smartphones. For instance, you might say that on the basis of our interaction with a sat-nav application like Google Maps, we extend our ability to orient ourselves in space. And there are a bunch of other examples. So basically, I think that, and I have argued that in order for a kind of technology to be a good candidate for extending our capacity for cognition, it must be such that we heavily and bidirectionally interact with it in a continuous manner, right? So that there is a good degree of integration between the agent, the body, and the device that they are employing.
Mm-hmm. Is augmented reality specifically a form of extended cognition?
Yes, I think it can be. Maybe not all instances of it, but certainly there are augmented reality applications that they do allow us to heavily interact with the technology in order to complete certain cognitive tasks. For instance, I know that it is used within architecture or design in order to visualize maybe how a building used to be, or how a building that someone wants to build is going to look like in the actual context that it is going to be built. Or maybe someone wants to design a new product, rather than actually trying to make a physical model of the product, they have an augmented reality design that is overlaid on the visual thing, and then they play around with it. And so by interacting, they discover aspects of the world. By interacting with the augmented reality system, they they solve a problem that perhaps otherwise they couldn't, or then they would have to interact with a physical aspect of the world. Mm-hmm. So I do think that augmented reality systems have the capacity to extend our cognitive abilities, and I also anticipate that augmented reality is going to be the next big thing within portable technologies. Probably we will have smart glasses soon, even smart lenses. And so it is important to start thinking about this kind of technologies in terms of cognitive extension, because if we think about those technologies just having the ability to extend our minds and our cognitive abilities, then that might make a difference to the way we approach the design, right?
Right. And what about virtual reality? Can it also be a form of extended cognition or not?
I think it can. Virtual reality is not much different from augmented reality. It's just that, with virtual reality, at least some of the more common present-day applications, they are not as interactive. It's more like passive. You sit there and you just observe a scene. However, they can be interactive, and so if you do interact heavily within with that technology, then in my books, as I mentioned before, it makes it a good candidate for counting as a case of cognitive extension. So yes, I think that whatever goes for augmented reality, the same goes for virtual reality as well.
So, because nowadays we have easy access to all of these forms of technology that grant us extended cognition, like, for example, computers, smartphones, the internet itself, do you think that students should be allowed to use Google during their exams?
I think that is a very interesting question that is likely to divide people. But I think, again, that the truth lies in the middle. So I think the answer depends on what is it that we want to test for. If we want to make sure that students have stored within their biological memories some information, and this is because perhaps we want someone to know really well that information, no matter whether they have some technology available to them, then perhaps we shouldn't use Google during exams. Whereas if we want to test students' ability to retrieve, collect, categorize, and then critically synthesize information in order to come up with a solution that displays understanding, then I don't see why disallowing Google searches would be necessary. And the interesting bit here is that, whether we use Google search or not, or other online technologies, when students take exams, does not really have to do with the specific topic, right? So I can imagine that, if you can allow a Google search during a history exam, and if you want to check whether students, they have properly understood a complex geopolitical event in history, or you might want to disallow Google search if you want to just test students' ability to remember dates or names, right? So it depends on what the teacher wants to do there and then. And the same goes for mathematics, for instance. If you want to test students' ability to provide a proof for a certain theorem, then you'd better not allow Google search because they can very easily find the proof and go copy. But if you want to see whether a student is able of I don't know, solving a complex physics problem that each solution requires lots of formulas that, it doesn't make sense to expect the student to actually have memorized all those formulas, then why not allow them to use Google search? At the end of the day, they're not going to be able to find the solution to the problem that, you have set out, right, as a question set. So I think that the answer is yes and no, and it all depends on what we are testing for. But certainly, we shouldn't disallow it, and we should be open-minded. And at the end of the day, given that now much of education have moved online, it's not even realistic to expect students that they're not going to check, right, Google sometimes.
Right. From the point of view of philosophy of mind, and since we're talking specifically about externalism, how can we understand culture? I mean, is it also a form of extended cognition? Could it be distributed cognition? What is it exactly?
Yeah, I think that's another very interesting question to think about. I'm not aware of any existing arguments in the literature to this effect, but the way I have it in my mind is that we can think about culture as some kind of, let's say, operating system like Windows or Mac OS X that exists like out there on the cloud, right, the cultural cloud, that everyone has the ability to download and through their actions and discoveries update constantly, right, and it can be passed on through generations, and it never stays the same, and it's continuously dynamically perhaps improved, or if not improved, altered, and it also allows, users of the same culture to efficiently communicate with each other. And, there are subcultures that you can think about those as, smaller operating systems, or, like the algorithm of a specific application. So, for instance, if you're a scientist working, let's say, on quantum mechanics, then you have downloaded, through your education, quantum mechanics, but maybe someone who is an astronomer, who's working with the general theory of relativity, then they have another operating system as a scientist in their mind. And, each can only talk about the specifics of the work to those colleagues that they also share the same kind of operating systems. So in that sense, we could think of culture as some kind of software that allows its users to collaborate with each other and perhaps operate as a distributed cognitive system.
Right. I was just thinking that if perhaps, so when we think about culture, usually you think about particular people that share it, but at the same time, it's the case that it's not each specific individual that stores the entire culture in their brain. There are people specialized in different parts of their culture, and each of them stores bits of that. But then at the same time, we talk about a culture, the culture of a people, for example, as if they share all aspects of that same culture. So, from a philosophical perspective, how we should deal with that kind of thing, or that kind of aspect of how we tend to think about culture and how people share it.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting observation, and it makes me again like following this software analogy. It makes me think that perhaps there are, several layers of culture, and that, there is perhaps the most general layer, which again, like it could be the Windows program that, every human computer has to have downloaded in order to then be able to download more specific applications, which are then specific aspects of culture that are compatible with your general operating system. And so, each user then will specialize through education, downloading in their minds more specific applications, right? Which are then specific corners of culture, pockets of culture. And so you have all these layers like built into each individual's mind, depending on what's their role in society.
Right. What is group know-how?
So group know-how refers to the ability of certain teams to manifest skills that perhaps cannot be reduced to the skills of the underlying members of the group. So one example could be the ability of a team of individuals to perform a strategy. So think about sports or think about football. The Spanish team was well known for being able to perform the tiki-taka. So that is a team strategy that you can perhaps attribute rather than to any individuals to the team as a whole. So that is a group know-how. It is a group skill. Other examples could be, let's say, team rowing, right? How people coordinate in order to row together. Or it could be partner dancing, how people they can interact with each other in order to perform certain dance moves, or perhaps improvise during a tango dance. That could be also a kind of group know-how that belongs to the team rather than to any of the underlying individuals.
Right. Is collective knowledge better understood at the individual level?
So, there are a few people who have been thinking about this idea of collective knowledge, which now is the idea that perhaps there are instances of knowledge, that there are propositions that they might be known only by groups of people rather than any individuals. And some of those researchers within epistemology that they have focused on this idea, they prefer to not commit themselves to any specific way of understanding individual knowledge. Rather, they think that, collective knowledge is a phenomenon of its own, and let's approach it independently of how individuals get to know. In my research, I prefer to try and explain collective knowledge by modeling it after an approach to individual knowledge. I think that it is possible to organize teams of individuals in a way that functionally imitates the way our brains produce knowledge. And so if that is true, then, if I am correct, then we could say that, look, collective knowledge and individual knowledge do not have to be two different phenomena. They're just expressions of the same phenomenon, which is a specific organization of how specific nodes process information. It just happens that in one case, those nodes are found within an individual's head, whereas in the other case, they're distributed between several individuals at the same time. So my bet is that this is doable. It is possible to understand collective knowledge in the same way that we understand individual knowledge. We'll see.
So, but in that case, and talking about individuals as nodes and comparing all of these with the brain or what happens in the brain, would individuals be neurons then?
In the case of the brain, or so yes, that's the idea that it's not about so yes, the specific details of how neurons work should not matter. What matters is probably is the way they're organized and their ability to exemplify certain epistemic properties, such as the property to self-organize and the property to self-regulate from an epistemic point of view. So, as I mentioned before, when you were asking me about the externalism, internalism distinction within epistemology, and I said, well, internalists require that we are able to provide reasons, whereas externalists, they only require that, we are somehow reliable and epistemically responsible, but without providing reasons. And I said that, hey, look, the way that we individuals might achieve this is through the integrated nature of the different components of our belief system, and that the one is monitoring the other continuously. And if there is something wrong, there is an alert signal. If there is nothing wrong, then due to this constant monitoring, you can be confident in what you're believing, even if you lack reasons in support of your belief. I think that groups of individuals can be organized in the same way, so that they can keep checking on each other depending on their specialization, and also in the process organize in a reliable fashion so that they can produce knowledge that, or at least propositions that most of the time they are true. And so what I want to see is, how does the human brain do that? What is it about the human brain that allows it to self-organize and self-regulate? And then can we organize groups so that they can also self-organize and self-regulate, so they can monitor each other and produce beliefs in a reliable and epistemically responsible manner on the basis of this constant monitoring? And I think that it is doable, especially with some of the technologies that Web 2.0 now provides, right? The social web. And, as technologies become better and better, we integrate more with them, and the ability for communicating with others is going to be even more efficient. Then I think it's going to become easier and easier to organize individuals so that they can functionally imitate what happens within their own heads, but now as a team of individuals, as a super agent, let's say, or a super organism.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you more about science specifically now. So is it that the kinds of questions we've been talking about here would also apply in the philosophy of science? So, for example, could they help us answer or perhaps develop new questions in the realm of the philosophy of science?
Yes, I definitely think so. And there is a multitude of ways that this kind of approach to epistemology might affect our understanding of science. We were talking about extended cognition and the ability to use technologies in order to transcend the organismic boundaries of our cognitive abilities. Definitely, matter science is performed by using scientific instruments. So, sometimes if we want to better understand what scientists do, then we better think about extended cognition, right? That's one example. Another example that we've already mentioned is, sometimes teams of scientists, when they come together to collaboratively perform scientific experiments, it's very likely that it's best to think about them as a distributed cognitive system. And then we can think about distributed cognition and collective knowledge in order to see how we could perhaps organize those scientists even more efficiently, so that they can even more reliably and responsibly produce knowledge. Another interesting question that has started being discussed within philosophy of science is our constant use of machine learning algorithms in order to discover all sorts of interesting scientific facts. And the problem with machine learning, for instance, and specifically deep learning, is the opacity of those algorithms. We do not know how they process information and why they generate some of the results that they do. And so that now raises the question, can we know on the basis of this kind of opaque algorithms that we do not know how they process information? And that now speaks back to the distinction between internalism and externalism, because if you are an internalist, you might say, no, you cannot know, because you cannot offer reasons in support of the belief that the algorithm, that the machine algorithm generated, because we don't know how it works. Whereas an externalist might say, well, it's not necessary to have such reasons. Rather, what is necessary is to make sure that, this algorithm is reliable in the sense that, 99.9 of the times that it produces an output, it is a true output, and that somehow this algorithm is a responsible algorithm, not in the sense that it can provide reasons for the outputs that it gives, but rather, it has some kind of monitoring mechanism that allows it to be aware, or at least to have those alert signals that will let it know that, look, maybe now I'm malfunctioning. Maybe now it's one of those 0.01 instances where I am unreliable, and so I'd rather stop myself or whatever, And so again, depending on how we think about knowledge within the way that individuals produce it, might also affect the way we think about knowledge, in the way scientists using the tools produce it, or a team of scientists, or even scientists relying on, state-of-the-art machine learning algorithms that we don't even know how they operate. And that all might affect, that might also, all this theory within let's say, extended epistemology or social extended epistemology might affect the design of those scientific instruments or scientific teams or machine learning algorithms.
So, but do you think that by learning or get a better understanding of how scientists produce knowledge, we can better answer the question of what really is the scientific method? Because I know that for hundreds of years now, people have been discussing, philosophers particularly, what is the scientific method, and there's not really a definite answer to that. And then also perhaps tackle or help tackle questions like surrounding the demarcation problem and distinguishing science from pseudoscience. Do you think that with this knowledge we can help answer those questions?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because it does seem that there is no well-defined method within science that scientists can always follow, or at least have always followed, for the sake of scientific progress. I guess what we need, as I said before, is that when we know we are both reliable and epistemically responsible, and this responsibility relies on this constant monitoring. So I guess what really makes, as we also know from Karl Popper, what really makes a theory scientific is that it can be tested, it can be, if not rejected, at least you can get alert signals against it, right? That you can then use to tread more carefully, as it were. And so long as you don't get any alert signals, then you can proceed with more confidence, provided, of course, that you're testing the theory. And so this is what seems to be very important, that we test our theories, that we can get alert signals, and that we do pay attention to those alert signals when they present themselves rather than ignoring them. And so what is the lesson that we can take from this is that, we must always empower scientists, either through the kind of scientific culture that we help, flourish among them, or with a kind of infrastructure that we provide to them that might be facilitated on the basis of technologies such as the internet, that they can present the views, and that the right kind of scientists can pay attention to them and try to test them, and then through this testing improve them, and have many interactive cycles of this constant monitoring process, and that's the kind of thing that we need to promote.
Right. So I would just like to ask you about one last topic. What is philosophical engineering?
So philosophical engineering is an idea that I first came across in a paper from Tim Berners-Lee, who is supposed to be the father of the web, and Jim Hendler, and a few more computer scientists, but with philosophical inclinations, have talked about it. Alexandre Monod and Harry Halpin. The idea is that computer science can do with a little bit of philosophy when it comes to designing or improving existing technologies and designing emerging ones. There is a bunch of ways that theories within philosophy of mind and cognitive science and theories within epistemology can actually affect the design of technologies, and they can also inform how we might educate future users of those technologies. So this is what is philosophical engineering, trying to use philosophy in order to engineer new technologies.
So in the context of our conversation, when it comes to philosophical engineering, would you also be interested in perhaps the sort of ways new and emergent technologies would impact our cognition?
Well, definitely. We talked about machine learning algorithms. One problem that a lot of people talk about is that those algorithms, they can be biased because of the biased data that we feed them. So doing a little bit of philosophy of mind and cognitive psychology on the topic of implicit bias might actually provide some really helpful insights about how to design less biased machine learning algorithms. There are also other ways that philosophy might impact the design of technologies, so as to perhaps make people less prone to certain potential dangers. So, for instance, one of the things that I have been working on lately has to do with the privacy of our minds. So, for instance, to a large degree, our minds are entirely private and inscrutable in the sense that you cannot see my detailed thoughts and memories, right, or my desires. You might infer a little bit of it sometimes if I allow you to, or if I'm not sufficiently secretive. But you can probably never see the entirety of what is going on within my head. But now, if some of the technologies that we heavily interact with, such as our smartphones, can be considered as extensions of our minds, then the data that they can contain, they can also be considered as part of your mind as well. So, maybe the photos in your phone can be thought of as your memories. And if that is the case, if we are willing to accept that, then suddenly we find ourselves presented with the threat that someone could look into the contents of our very minds. So what do we do about this? Because existing attempts to protect the right to privacy only care about whether others can legally obtain information about yourself. But when it comes to your mind so far, it has not just been illegal for others to look into it. We have been working under the assumption that it is impossible for others to look into our minds. No matter whether someone tortures you, or whether they beg you, or whether they ask you nicely, if you want to retain some information for you alone, others can do nothing about it, no matter whether the law allows or not. Whereas now, that might not be the case anymore. Why? Because this content is not just in your head anymore, but it might be situated outside your head, and now someone could hack into that extended mind of yours and access this information. And so what do we do? How do we design those technologies so that they can perhaps offer the same level of privacy that our heads have provided us so far? Should we do it? Should we keep using those technologies? Are we prepared for it as a society? Maybe we should go for it, but maybe we should expect some other problems down the line. Or how best to design those technologies in order that, so that they can offer the same level of privacy that our minds have offered so far. And before we can do that, perhaps stop relying on those technologies, or at least not in the same ways. Educate people about the potential dangers. Let them know and become aware of what it is that maybe they're stepping into, rather than just unwittingly keep using technologies and then suddenly finding ourselves in a situation that we were completely unprepared for.
Right. So, but since today we've been talking mostly about epistemology and philosophy of mind, in this case of philosophical engineering, I mean, you posed a lot of should questions. Should we do this? Should we do that? Would you say then that most of the questions, or at least a good part of the questions you're interested in there, are ethical in nature?
Probably they are. I don't consider myself to be an ethicist, but increasingly lately, I do find myself struggling with ethical questions. I mean, they are normative questions, right? Even within epistemology, it might not be obviously an ethical question, the question of how should we believe, but there are epistemic norms. This is a good way to form your beliefs, and this is a bad way to form your beliefs. And then you must explain why the first is a good way, the second one is a bad way. But you're right in saying that the more we focus on technologies, which of course it would be naive to consider that they do not embody values, then the more pronounced the ethical questions become. And so, we start finding ourselves in deep ethical waters where we have to now make specific choices depending on the kind of values that we hold dear. And if you notice, when I was talking about mental privacy, I did not make any specific claim one way or the other. I said, if we value our mental privacy as we know it, then we have to do certain things. Maybe we don't. Maybe, we want to give it up. But before we do, let's pause, take some time, and think about this very important value question rather than just, going for certain emerging technologies without even thinking about it, right? So it's about highlighting the ethical question rather than solving it, at least in the first place. Just alert people here that, look, there is an ethical question, let's think about it, because sometimes it's not so easy to realize that there is an ethical question there.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, so just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Sure. I have a personal website. I believe it is sopalermos.info. You can find my papers there. And I'd be delighted if people have any questions so that they can send me emails. I'm always very, very happy to discuss philosophy, and philosophy is a dialectical process. The more you discuss about it, the more you understand what it is that you think.
Right, so I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Palermos, again, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been really nice to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Likewise, that was a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah. Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. So, to keep the channel sustainable and to keep it running, I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page. You have all sorts of benefits there, and any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. You also have links to PayPal in the description box. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Parerga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrica Lenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columba, George Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, JW, João Meira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roch, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, my producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadraiano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.